When I was 8 years old, my uncle gave me a canoe paddle for my birthday, and that included an invitation to spend summers paddling through the Adirondacks with my aunt and uncle, which we cutesily named Camp McFox. And so every summer, for as long as I can remember, I've gotten to spend here paddling in these beautiful handmade wooden canoes. When I was 11, my uncle founded Otter Creek Smallcraft, which is...
It's a one-person operation building, as you've probably deduced by now, Cedar-Strip Canoes, custom built in Vermont.
And when I turned 18, my birthday gift was a canoe, which is insane to give to an 18-year-old. You're insane, by the way.
I'm insane, okay.
Certifiably insane. And because I had no space to store a canoe, I asked if I could postpone the gift until after I graduated from college. And then I graduated from college with an interest in making things. And so last Christmas, this gift sort of morphed into, why don't you come spend a month in Vermont and learn to make your own canoe? Please hang tight through this entire video. It's longer than most of my videos, but I think it's worth it. So
definitely worth it.
Yeah, enjoy. Once the forms are up, the first thing to do is to start shaping the stems. These are really thin strips of cedar that have been soaking in boiling water for about 10 minutes, and we just wrap them around the front of the form, let them dry, and then glue them together to laminate them. Then it's just a matter of shaping them with a hand plane to make the strips sit really nicely over them. Then we ripped down our dimensional lumber of western red cedar on the table saw. My uncle's signature is a feature strip that has these little chevrons made of sapwood, and those are paired in between sections of a dark hardwood. So we just cut the little shapes and then glued it together. And I love watching the pattern get revealed on the table saw when we trim off all the excess. Most strip boats are built out of strips that have a bead routed out of one end and a cove routed out of the other side. And this lets the strips nestle together over curves and not leave gaps where light can show through. So we took all of our square-ended strips and routed beads and coves into them. The first strip is clamped to the forms along the shear line and then trimmed to fit within the stems and glued in place.
Pretty much. Strong spring.
Once that was securely in place, we could build the rest of the strips on top of it. So to do that, we basically just ran a bead of wood glue along the cove of each strip and then fit it onto the previous strip, trimmed it, glued to the stems, and repeated. I also want to draw attention to the fact that all of the music you're hearing in the background were tunes written by my uncle and recorded by my aunt and uncle's bands, Atlantic Crossing and Frost and Fire. The only exception is that the very last song you'll hear over the Maiden Voyage is called The Aviatrix, and it was actually written by my aunt, and she wrote it for me when I flew an airplane solo for the first time. Once the strips reach the top of the stems, we switch over to just stripping on one side, and we'll do that all the way until we reach the center line, at which point we can put down a chalk line and cut a perfect line from stem to stem. And then on the other side, we just have to make the strips match up once. Here's a good look at the way bead and cove latches together. With the stripping done, it was time to ferret into shape, which means a lot of planing and then a lot of sanding. I wanted to inlay a cosmetic center strip that matched the width and the lines of both the exterior stems and the interior stems, which were different widths, which meant that we had to route and then install 2 separate center strips, one on the exterior and one on the interior. So for each strip, we only routed about 1/8 of an inch down and then glued the strip in, and then when we flip it over, we'll route another one. And what's really nice about them being different widths is it actually prevents any light show through because there's a step in the center strip. Before fiberglassing the entire hull with 4-ounce fiberglass, we went over the stems with 12-ounce fiberglass tape, just for extra reinforcement. And then to put on the logos, we printed them onto overhead transparency and then just epoxied them directly to the wood. And with those in place, we could move on to fiberglassing the entire hull. Now, fiberglass is how boats get most of their strength, and it's applied by rolling this sheet of literally fiberglass onto the boat, and then pouring epoxy over and allowing it to seep through the weave, adhering it to the wood. It's a really satisfying process, and once you get the hang of it, it can be pretty fun. And you'll notice that as long as you have a perfectly clear epoxy like this one, which is the TotalBoat 2-to-1 high performance epoxy, as the epoxy soaks into the fiberglass, it turns it completely clear. And that's because fiberglass and epoxy have the same refractive index, which means as light passes through it, it doesn't bend, which means it's clear. When the epoxy is green, which is when it's started to set but it's not completely cured yet, that's the best time to cut off the excess fiberglass. It just cuts really easily with a knife. It takes about 4 coats of epoxy to completely bury the weave, at which point you can sand it super smooth, and that gets the surface ready for varnishing. But varnishing will happen at the very end, so now it's time to pull out the forms and flip it over for the first time.
What's the truth?
It has boat-like features.
It would even float. No, it didn't.
This part is pretty much the same as the outside, the only difference being that the random orbital sander can't really get up the curves very well, so it was just a lot of time with a card scraper before going in with a lot of hand sanding. And on the inside, we routed a thinner center strip, glued it in place, and then planed it down. Exactly the same. The steep recurve on this particular design of bow and stern makes it really difficult for one sheet of fiberglass to go all the way up into the nose and lay perfectly flat. So what we did is fiberglass it in 3 sections, and honestly it looks perfectly seamless. Yeah, Peter is that kind of uncle. Now you know what I've been putting up with my whole life. Then a few more epoxy coats and the weave is buried. And that concludes the construction of the hull, once it's sanded, of course. Instead of making you watch me sand, I'm going to introduce the sponsor for today's video, Honey. Honey is a free browser extension that finds promo codes for you and automatically applies them to your cart. So imagine you're shopping on one of your favorite sites for a last-minute life jacket and you find this one, which just offends your fashion sense in the most delightful way. And when you check out, the Honey button drops down and all you have to do is click Apply Coupons. Wait a few seconds as Honey scans its database of all the working coupons for that site and watch your price drop. I saved $38 and I get to be extra fashionable and safe. all summer. Honey supports over 30,000 stores online, so whether I'm replacing that countersink drill bit I broke or stocking up on my favorite anti-sawdust moisturizing cream, Honey's got my back. To get Honey, simply go to joinhoney.com/Xyla, because if you don't already have it, you could be straight up missing out on free money. It's free and it installs in just a few seconds, plus you'll be doing me a solid and supporting my channel. Get Honey for free at joinhoney.com/Xyla. Since the Gunwales, decks, seats, thwart, etc. all happened kind of at the same time, the edit stops being perfectly chronological just so it makes more sense, but you can always see what day things are happening in the bottom left corner. Once the Gunwales were completely ripped and routed, we went in with the oscillating saw and cut the shear line about like 1 millimeter above where the shear line actually is, so that gives us a little bit of wiggle room to plane down to the Gunwales later on. And then it was time to epoxy the scupper pieces on. Scupper pieces are the inserts that let the in-whale stand off from the hull sheathing, which leaves the scuppers, which is the holes behind. And those are great for making the boat lighter, but also tying stuff in and for draining water. So the longer pieces that you see are at the thwart and the seats, and that's just because there's more strain on the bolts there. With the in-whales and their scuppers fully assembled and cleaned up, we could epoxy them to the inside of the hull. This just means carefully lining it up with the midpoint and also the shear line, and then using lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of clamps. The outwhales, which are the outer strip of the Gunwales, are a little easier to assemble just because they have no scuppers, so that was just some epoxy and then a lot of clamps again. Also, I think it's important to note that the Gunwales, the thwart, deck thwarts, seats, etc. are all made of cherry, so all of the trim is cherry, which is much harder and stronger. And for added strength, we also screwed the Gunwales together using a special depth-stopped countersunk drill bit, meaning that we can go in with a piece of cherry we make on a plug cutter and fill in that hole to make it nice and pretty. And then we cleaned up the Gunwales by sanding off the tops of those plugs, as well as planing down the shear line to meet the Gunwales and sanding it smooth. Moving on to the decks, we made these out of cutoffs from building the rest of the canoe, and we cut and glued these into the same angle that the Gunwales meet at the bow and stern to continue that line. The decks are cedar stripped to save on weight, but that does mean that for strength we need to fiberglass both sides. So both sides get fiberglassed and then sanded and then varnished before installation. Now, since the decks aren't hardwood, they're cedar stripped, they're not structural on their own, so we have to make a hardwood deck thwart to act as the structural component of the decks.
Good fit. It was a good fit.
Then, to fit the deck for final assembly, we just had to flatten the topmost edge of the Gunwales so that there was something for the cedar strip deck to adhere to, and then we could just use a thickened epoxy mixture to put it all together. And once the epoxy was fully cured, we could just shape the deck to match the shape of the Gunwales and move on to cutting the shape of the deck towards the hull of the boat. I chose this gentle arc just because I thought it was graceful, and I just cut it out with a jigsaw and then went at it with a chisel and then a saw and a lot of sandpaper, just a lot of hand tools. And to cover the awkward 3 layers that now make up the deck, we just cut out really thin pieces of cherry to use as veneers, cut them to shape, and fit them. And once those are glued in and sanded smooth, the decks are done. To make the thwart, I drew the shape that I wanted onto a piece of cardboard and then traced it onto a piece of cherry. And it's worth noting that I made the width exactly the width of my shoulders because it's a canoe for me.
Whoa, it's nice to have made a thwart that is made to fit me.
Can't go wait to go running with this canoe.
You said that on record.
Yeah, but I have the power to delete the record. And then to finish it, we just hit it with the roundover bit on the table router, and then sanded it and varnished it. Then it was just a matter of shaping it to fit around the gunnels, like really nice and snug, and then finding the center balance point of the canoe and installing. And the Thwart is done. So here's my first solo canoe carry. I was just really excited to try out that Thwart. To make the seat frames, we put them together using simple mortise and tenon joinery to get that square frame, and then epoxied it all together. Then, to get them ready for caning, we drilled holes at 1-inch increments all down the sides and then countersunk those holes. Then the frames just needed to get rounded over and varnished. To prep for hanging the seats from the gunnels, we used this homemade jig to countersink using a Forstner bit, and then we drilled all the way through the gunnels with a normal straight bit afterwards. Then, using this simple angle gauge, we measured and cut seat hangers that fit all of the compound angles of the hull against the gunnel, drilled them, and measured out the seats. Then we just needed to cane them, and we use plastic cane rather than natural cane just because it lasts a little longer, and it's a great cat toy. And with the seats fully caned, we can move on to the hull and do a final sanding up to 220 grit, which will get it ready for varnish. Then it's really important to clean the hull as well as you can, because any dust or hair, etc. will show up in the final varnish. We built up about 6 coats of base varnish using TotalBoat's Halcyon before switching over to Lust, which is what you're seeing here, to use as a shiny, glossy final coat. Halcyon is water-based, so it's really easy to clean up and way more eco-friendly than traditional varnishes, but realistically, you're not going to get like the perfect finish coat with it, so that's why we used a traditional varnish for the final varnish. And this is how we put on the layers of Halcyon. I rolled it on with a really dense foam roller, and then Uncle Peter chased with a foam brush, tipping it, meaning that he was gently brushing across the top, removing all of the weird texture and the bubbles. But for the final coats with Lust, we used badger hair brushes directly with no roller. And with the varnish done, it was just time to install the seats and head out on the Maiden Voyage. The purpose of this sliding bow seat is so that I, as the generally lighter person, can paddle stern and have a heavier person paddle in the bow without being bow heavy, or I can have someone lighter in the bow.
Don't fall out.
Whoa. It's almost like you designed this for getting boats out.
No, it's really for when the snow is that deep, you can still get in and out in winter.
Oh, right.
First real carriage.
Ma'am, I'm looking for some water. You know where I might find some water? Lake Champlain's about 8 miles that way. 8 miles? No problem. It's only 43 pounds.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider clicking the subscribe button and the little bell so that you get notified every time I post a new video. Additionally, I've also made a longer, more technical version of this build video, and it's up on my Patreon, linked down in the description below. Thanks so much for watching. To commission a custom canoe, visit my uncle's website at ottercreeksmallcraft.com, and he's even offering guided builds like this one as an option. See you there!